here today to debate, to find out more and to learn. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's come today. Oh, my voice is getting louder here. I'd like to say thank you to the sponsors. Without them, it wouldn't be possible to accommodate everyone. And I'd like to say thank you to the panel. We will have 10 minutes on 6 different topics. I'll be asking the panel a series of questions. Then after that, we will have about 20-25 minutes where the audience can ask questions to the panel. I would ask you please not to ask questions of a personal nature relating to your own personal circumstances. And to remember that the panel are not here to give tax or financial advice. If you would like to speak to a particular member of the panel on a particular subject relating to your own circumstances, then you may do afterwards during the networking session. So I'd appreciate your help on that. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce the panel. First of all, we have Paul Mahoney from Nova Financial. Over to you, Paul.
Hello, I'm Paul Mahoney. I'm the founder and managing director at Nova Financial. We're a property investment and finance advisory company. We essentially advise people on how to achieve financial freedom through property investment.
And now over to Tony Gimple, Less Tax for Landlords.
Hi, my name's Tony Gimple, and I'm one of the owners of a company called Less Tax for Landlords, which surprisingly does what it says on the tin. Our role is to help landlords run highly tax-efficient, professional property businesses in order to achieve their personal and family wealth goals.
Thank you, Tony. And I'd like to introduce Richard Blanco, who is a landlord himself, an expert, and here also representing the National Landlords Association.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Richard Blanco. I am the London representative for the National Landlords Association. I'm also a landlord with properties across 6 London boroughs. What else to say? Yes, I talk at lots of events like this, and I've got a blog, and we also have the NLA podcast that we publish once a month as well. So up to various things. So happy to be here. Thank you.
And also Andy Wynne-Jones from Simple Landlords Insurance.
Hi, I'm Andy. I'm senior underwriter from Simple Landlords Insurance. So we specialise in landlords, whether you're individual properties or multi-portfolio investors. Been doing this 3 years. Prior to that, I was head of product development at HomeLet for about 10 years, and I have a portfolio of 6 properties myself.
Thank you very much. Now, as time is fairly tight, we will go on to our first major topic. Tax relief and stamp duty. I'm sure these are 2 points that concern most people in the room. I'd like to start off by asking our panel about the 3% additional homes stamp duty that landlords who've bought new properties or adding to their portfolios now have to pay. We thought that the Chancellor might do something about this in the budget. He didn't. The big question, of course, is it here to stay? Paul, what do you think?
I hope not, although it's here to stay for now, so we can only work with what the current rules are. So if it is here to stay, I suppose we just need to deal with it. That those that it's going to affect most is higher value properties, given the current thresholds are already higher for higher value properties, whereas lower value properties are less affected.
And Tony, can you tell us your perspective on this tax?
Yeah, suck it up. It's here. It's not going to go. It's a transactional tax. You'll get it back when you sell it. It's just the cost of doing business. Is the Chancellor going to make a U-turn on it? Fat chance. And the same with Section 24. You've just got to pay it.
Thank you very much. Richard, a landlord yourself, have you paid this tax?
I haven't, no. And in fact, I bought my last property just before it came in, so I was feeling a bit smug about that. In fact, there was that small window between when stamp duty was changed from that previous slab system before the 3% surcharge came in was quite a nice time to buy something under £1 million, and I was very lucky with that. But what I would say on the 3% surcharge is in the first 6 months, the Chancellor collected 670 million, and the target was 625 million for the whole year. So you can see that it's been very successful from the Chancellor's perspective. So I think he's pretty, or very unlikely really, to not continue with it. 860,400 people paid the surcharge in the first 6 months, 60% of which were landlords. So it's not deterring people as much as we thought it might do, although, of course, the volumes certainly of lending have dropped a lot. There is a general unhappiness about it, lots of lobbying to get rid of it, but there doesn't seem to be much interest in getting rid of it. And it particularly adversely affects London, of course, because 45% of stamp duty comes from London, and it's really affecting the properties at the top end as well.
Thank you. Have you got anything you'd like to add to that, Andy?
Yes, not really an insurance issue, but we do periodically survey our landlords, and the last survey we carried out a few months ago showed that about 32% of them were still planning to increase their portfolios. So I think, to echo Richard's comments, I think it's not going to have a huge impact, I don't think.
That's an interesting point, because I've been writing on Property Aware recently. There was some very extensive research done by the Council of Mortgage Lenders. In fact, it was the most extensive research they've done with a YouGov poll. And they found that had a similar result to simple landlords. They found that the majority of landlords have not been put off extending their portfolio by this additional tax. So there's a little bit of a good news there. And of course, as well as the additional tax, we've got the, starting in a couple of weeks' time, the fact that mortgage tax relief will start reducing. What's your take on that, Paul?
My take on that, again, we need to deal with it. Understand how it's going to affect you, and understand what the strategies are that you can do to mitigate it. I think, just finishing off on that final point that Tony raised a good point there, we found that a lot of people don't realise that the extra stamp duty is a capital cost, so you will actually get between 18 and 28% of it back, depending on your tax position. And when you look at the fact that property has grown in value by an average of around 5.5% over the past 20 years, you're getting it back in half a year anyway, on average. So far as the tax relief goes with mortgage interest, they've made it a little bit complicated in my view, and again, there's a lot of misunderstanding associated with it. A lot of people aren't really sure how it's going to affect them, or if it's going to affect them. Also, a lot of people think that they're not going to be able to offset any of the mortgage interest anymore, when in actual fact there is a tax credit, so you do get some of it back in some way, shape or form. So I suppose understanding how it affects you, understanding the strategies you can utilise to mitigate it, or to avoid it altogether through various different vehicles.
Would you agree, Tony?
In a word, yes. Section 24, the removal of mortgage interest relief, is, yes, it's an attack on landlords. However, it's not an insurmountable problem. It is a fact of business, and will only affect you if you are either already a higher rate taxpayer, or as a result in the change in the way the calculation is done, will push you in to a higher rate taxpayer. Whatever you do, however, do not incorporate your portfolio solely as a means of getting over Section 24. On the one hand, yes, it gets rid of it completely. On the other hand, you will put yourself in a significantly worse financial position, a highly restricted financial position, and you will pay more and more and more and more simply by being a limited company.
Could that also be affected by the dividend change that the Chancellor announced? Well,
look, the dividend change is clearing up some old-fashioned tax law. Dividend income, what part of income don't you understand? Therefore should be taxed as income. In a couple of years or so, the whole thing about tax-free dividends will likely disappear together. Look, the one thing about being in limited companies, they are totally visible to HMRC. They see every penny in, every penny out, and how it got there, and will tax you at every stage. Corporation tax. And by the way, if you're holding buy-to-lets for the sole purpose of collecting rents for 12 months or more, you're running an investment company, and it's not beyond the wit of any chancellor to introduce differential rates of corporation tax for investment companies. You will have dividend tax, you will have income tax, and you will have national insurance. Worst of all, because it is an investment company, it doesn't qualify for what's called business relief and is 100% subject to inheritance tax.
Thank you, Tony. And Richard, what's your take on this one?
Yes, I mean, we shouldn't forget from a campaigning perspective that the new tax regime is very unfair. It's very unfair for us to be taxed on our turnover and not on our profits. And with the NLA wants landlords to be seen as running businesses and to be taxed fairly as businesses. We're, a bit more pessimistic about the implications. From our research, 65% of landlords say it will decrease their profitability, and it will particularly affect landlords with larger portfolios, so 11 or more properties. There's also concern about the lack of understanding out there. So 52% of landlords anticipate that there will be no change to their business from the tax changes. But of those, only 57% say they fully understand the tax changes. So we're concerned there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. And, I've certainly spoken to my accountant, and we've worked out what my tax bill is going to be on the 31st of January, 2021. So I recommend that you do that, as much as you can. Our latest research says that 1 in 5 landlords are thinking of incorporating, and I personally wouldn't recommend it. Very pleased to hear what you were saying, Tony. I mean, if you just look at a £300,000 mortgage, on buy-to-let at the best rates are 1.59% at the moment, you'd be paying $4,700 a year in interest. If you had to move that to a commercial mortgage because you've incorporated, then you're looking at a rate of around about 4%. Okay, you can get a bit lower, 3.2 I think is the lowest, but at 4% you'd be looking at £12,000 a year. So and that's not including the arrangement fee. So you'd be paying so much more interest on a commercial mortgage that you might as well just kind of suck up the extra tax. So and also, everyone could rush around and get incorporated only for the government to suddenly change the goalposts on tax around incorporation. So it doesn't feel like the right thing to do to me.
Thank you, Richard. Yes,
Sorry, yeah. On that whole business, if you've got an existing portfolio, you will have to remortgage when you move it into a limited company. Things like beneficial company interest trusts are not the flavour of the month for lenders, because they cannot perfect their security. So apart from the transactional cost of remortgaging, once you do it in the name of a limited company, a lot of lenders, commercial lenders, will put a debenture, a charge on your balance sheet. And that will do 2 things. One, it will make it very difficult for you to use your director's loan account without consent. And secondly, it ties you to that lender. Because if they lose their appetite, you won't be able to get a second charge. And if you want to buy more property, you've got to repeat the whole exercise again. New company, new lender, new debenture, and so on. But I'm pleased to say there are ways where you can legitimately not suffer from Section 24, reduce the overall taxation across the board, and grow your portfolio very successfully as a result.
Does somebody get advice on that from their accountant or a tax expert?
Okay, all right.
It's quite clear that incorporation is not a coping strategy for this.
It is definitely not a corporate.
Where does a landlord go to get the right advice?
Look, you're between a rock and a hard place on this one, and you can very easily end up as a victim. The vast majority of accountants are A, backward-looking, and 2, are not entrepreneurs. And 3, they haven't got a clue about running a professional property business. Great for your bog standard limited company accounts or personal tax returns, but running a professional property business is a highly specialised subject, and there are only a handful of firms in the country who can pull everything together to give you what you want.
Thank you very much, Tony. Now, in a word, if I could ask each of you, how much is this going to have an effect on future investment? In a word, Paul.
Yes, it will have an effect. I think all of these changes, you combine the stamp duty with the mortgage interest relief, and then you combine that further with the way that lenders are now looking at how much you can borrow for a buy-to-let property and the rents you need to cover that. It increases the importance of yields. The age-old strategy of buying and just breaking even for the purpose of growth, that's being put into question.
We will come on to yields later, so...
Okay, sorry, I won't go too much on that, but I suppose I think the effect is that the strategy needs to change slightly. It's going to affect mostly higher value, lower yielding properties.
Thank you. You agree, Tony?
Actually, no, I don't. Sorry, Paul. At the end of the day, if you're running a proper business, it won't make a blind bit of difference. And you mustn't let the tax tail wag the planning dog.
There you are. Richard, you're nodding there.
Yes, I am, because I worry about people organising their business around today's tax regime, because it may well change tomorrow. So you need to have some sound business principles in place there for your business. So, you need to know what your business model is, where you're investing, why, what your product is. Have plenty of spreadsheets that show the whole thing adds up. I think that tax changes will affect levels of investment. NLA research suggests that 16% of landlords are planning to sell. 16% of landlords are also planning to expand. So there's a kind of mixed picture there. But there's no doubt that if you are expanding, you need to be a much more savvy investor now than you could be 10 years ago. So you really need to think about buying in areas of infrastructure improvement to try and be more secure about any capital growth. The focus must be on yields, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that more. You need to really know about licensing and Article 4 directions and this plethora of regulation that we've had over the last few years. So it's a very different business, really, that people are coming into now than it would have been a few years back.
Any last word there, Andy?
Yes, I guess just to echo some of the comments we've already seen, from our survey, almost 90% of landlords still expected to be a landlord in 2 years' time. So we're not seeing a plethora of people looking to sell up. In fact, we've seen a 25% reduction in people cancelling policies over the last 12 months because they're selling the properties. So I think what we're seeing is investors are sort of sitting tight and they're waiting to see what happens next.
Thank you, Andy. I'd like to move on to our next major topic, which is the B word, Brexit. Right. This is good or bad news for landlords or indifferent?
Well, I suppose similar to all the other changes we've already discussed, it's about working out a way of dealing with it. Obviously, the impact will all be determined by the terms of what Brexit actually is. I don't think anyone knows what that actually is at the moment. But I suppose echoing some of the words we just mentioned is basing your investment on solid fundamentals that will stay solid regardless of changes with Brexit is probably the wisest move.
And Tony, what are your thoughts on this one?
Welcome to a free and independent Britain.
You're the wrong region, I think.
I come from immigrant stock, so like brown on the inside, although my lot came from Eastern Europe. When they were digging up Crossrail, they found an old cemetery, did DNA analysis, and the ethnic mix was no different 500 years ago as it is now, and we fought the same battle then, when Henry kicked out the Pope, and we've been fighting it ever since. Truth of the matter is, London, Britain is the centre of the known universe. We are all here for a reason. I was asking my Bulgarian dentist why he came here, and he said, money. Bingo. Apart from Iceland and the Galapagos, they've stopped making land. We, on the other hand, have not stopped making people. All right, so Brexit, at the end of the day, won't make a blind bit of difference. You still need a roof over your head. Not everybody wants to buy. Not everybody can afford to buy. The market's here.
And Richard, are you...
Is Brexit good or bad for landlords? Well, it's definitely hit the market. Uncertainty isn't good for the market, is it? And we're definitely seeing a fall in tenant demand. In our research, 14% of landlords reported a decrease in demand, and 43% in central London. And it's falling at its highest level for over 5 years. I've had 2 properties on the market in the last few months for rental, and it's certainly been a lot slower than I've known it for some time. We're also seeing a rebalance between first-time buyers and landlords. So according to countrywide research in 2015, only 16% of first-time buyers, I've got this the wrong way around, 11% of first-time buyers were beaten by, 16% of first-time buyers were beaten by landlords when they were trying to buy, and only 11% were beaten in 2016. So the idea is that there's a rebalance, it's making it easier for first-time buyers to beat landlords, which of course is what the government wants. I think probably what's a bit more interesting than the impact of Brexit is where we are in the house price cycle, because if you think the recession began in 2008, we're 9 years on now. So when is the next recession going to be? You know, when is the next peak of the cycle going to be? Are we already at the peak? Have we already seen prices start to drop? So that's what I'm most interested in, because I think I will probably start selling at the next peak, at the peak of the next cycle, which I think will probably be sort of it's somewhere in the middle of the 20s. So that's something that I'm trying to get my head around at the moment, and it's very hard to get a sense of that because, of course, we've never had a Brexit before. We've never had a Scottish referendum with a Brexit. It's really hard to know what's going to happen, and uncertainty, I think, is the name of the game at the moment.
And Andy, also if I could direct you to the issue of regulations. I mean, we're all bound by a mass of EU regulations, which I think, if you believe the headlines, are all going to melt away. How are landlords with their insurance and that aspect of their business going to cope with Brexit?
It's an interesting question. I think uncertainty is probably the key word, and our research indicates that people are sitting tight and they're going to wait to see what happens. From an insurance perspective, I don't see the landscape changing dramatically over the next few years. Capacity will still be there. Landlords' business for insurers is good business. So I don't see the rates changing at all purely because of Brexit, but uncertainty does carry a little bit of risk, a bit of the unknown.
So, demand post-Brexit, demand post-Brexit, will it be there, Paul?
Well, I think if you look at the demand at the moment, we have a requirement for 300,000 new units per annum, and we're building around 150 to 170,000. So only about half of what's required. That's UK-wide. You look at London, there's about 50,000 we require, and we're building about 20,000. So there's a huge imbalance there. And I think that's one of the major concerns with Brexit. That imbalance is going to change, but it would have to change very significantly for it to have a major impact on the market, which I don't think it will.
And what do you think of that, Tony?
I've probably been seeing about 5 new people a day, every day for the last 6 months. All pretty much existing landlords and some new. Yes, people were concerned about Brexit, but at the end of the day, they're actually more concerned about making money for themselves. And what it has shown is that you need to concentrate on yields and not on capital growth, because that can be a real recipe for disaster.
And we'll talk about yields coming up, yes.
Ultimately, will Brexit make a difference? Maybe. Who knows? But we're back to that same basic fact. There are more people needing homes than there are homes available. So whilst demand exceeds supply, the economics will speak for itself.
Would you agree, Richard?
Well, a lot of what's driven demand, particularly in London, has been EU migration, of course. So I think there are a lot of unknowns here. We were expecting the population in London to increase by 1 million over the next 10 years. Does that still hold true? Certainly the birth rate is very high in London, so there are lots of new people being created by the existing population. And anecdotally, it feels like, I house quite a lot of Eastern Europeans, and it feels like people are less willing to commit to new 12-month contracts. There seems to be kind of a last few people's cousins coming over and so on before Brexit. So I feel like there's a lot of uncertainty, really, and there's the whole question over whether landlords with larger portfolios will sell off some of the properties because it just simply won't be profitable to keep them all. And certainly I'm at a point with my portfolio size where there's absolutely no point in me buying any more properties because any additional profit will just get eaten up by tax.
And Andy, Brexit, hunky-dory?
I think we're just going to have to wait and see. It's uncertain. Certainly from an insurance perspective, we don't see much change coming in that respect.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to the big one, yields and costs. It's been mentioned already from the panellists that yields will need to be looked at. You should know where your figures are in order to survive in this post-tax change Brexit world. So how are yields going to be impacted, Paul, by all this change?
I don't necessarily, well, if we're talking net yields, of course any increased cost would reduce the yields. I think the common theme throughout the panel is more so that as a landlord, yields are becoming more important, and making sure you're assessing your current portfolio and any future investments on a yield basis, more so potentially than you would have before. Especially, if generally in the past, when you're looking to create wealth, the main focus would have been just capital growth. But that's all well and good, but if you can't support your portfolio, especially in a higher interest rate environment, then that's you're not going to get there. So making sure you're putting enough emphasis on that you can support your portfolio and continue to grow it. But if you're an existing landlord, then understanding how these changes might affect your net outcomes.
That's the key. Anything to add to that, Tony?
Show me the money and pay me before I start, and let the cash register ring whilst I'm on the beach or asleep. Relying upon capital growth is something over which you have zero control, because the growth in property values is largely based on sentiment, a bit like equities. Rents, however, yields, you can control. So our feeling is, anecdotally, observationally, practically, that if you're a landlord, how much can you sweat that particular asset to get the income you want? Once you've got the income, you can turn that into capital 40 ways from Sunday. But simply relying upon the capital growth in order to create your wealth is outside your control. And if you get unlucky, like I did when we came out of the ERM back in the 90s, you end up with mega negative equity and real pain. Our advice is borrow as little as you can, maximise the rents as much as you can, and if it's worth anything as a capital value when you get up to sell it, whoopee-doo, but you've already had the money beforehand.
Thank you. Richard, how important are yields from your perspective as a landlord?
Yes, from my perspective as a landlord, my minimum yield was always 6% when I bought. I've always bought at auction and sort of bought wrecks and refurbished them and tried to add value to the property. So yields are very important to me, and they've been really important in terms of buy-to-let mortgages, because I've then been able to add value, refinance, buy more properties and so on. And I've always been a bit shocked where people buy with properties with yields of 3 and 4%, and only just make the thing work. The NLA research tells us that the average yield is 5.8%, that's rental yield, and 84% of landlords currently make a profit. So, most of us are making a decent profit. I think yields are going to come much more into focus this year with the change in buy-to-let lending rules, because where currently it was probably pretty easy to get a 75% mortgage, certainly in London. I've gone back and recalculated some of my loans, and I would have got 58% loan to value on the new criteria that the Bank of England is forcing lenders to use. So I think landlords are going to be chasing much higher yields and possibly looking in areas where they're not used to looking, and trying to run HMOs, etc. Getting harder, though, of course, with Article 4 directions, so you really need to get on top of that sort of regulation and make sure you don't write a business plan that means buying lots of HMOs in Newham, because you'll never get a licence for them.
Thank you. Andy, how does yields impact when you deal with people relating to their insurance?
Well, yields obviously key to this market, and the cost of insurance would have to come out of that. What we're expecting to see at Simple Landlords is people diversifying portfolios. So we're investing in that part of our infrastructure. So we're looking at HMOs, as Richard mentions. We're looking at people insuring mixed commercial, potentially even going into holiday lets. So areas that typically generate greater yields, but do carry more risk.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm just going to be very naughty and ask you for a prediction. You've been lucky to have rock bottom interest rates. There's still no sign. The Bank of England kept them the same again. Paul, when are they going to start going up? Very briefly.
Well, I think the best way to determine financial markets in general, just obviously different things determine different impacts, but if you have a look at the interest rates have worked, how they've worked in the past, generally they'll move in one general direction for some period of time. They'll then plateau, and because monetary policy is a slow fix, it takes at least 2 to 3 years for a change in interest rates to work its way through the economy. So generally what will happen is they'll move in one direction, they'll plateau, it will take some time for them to have their impact, and then they'll move in the other direction. And I think we're at that plateau. So unless there's although inflation's rising, I think with things like Brexit and uncertainty, the interest rates won't go anywhere anytime soon. And if I'm to put a date on it, I'd say they'll probably stay where they are until around 2019.
What do you think? When are they going to start going up, Tony?
Yes.
When?
Yes. Sorry, I've got two eyes. I'm not the Cyclops. I don't have the gift of foresight, neither do I have a crystal ball which is ever clear. Interest rates will rise. When? I don't know. Does anybody actually know? So make hay while the sun shines. Keep at fixed rates. Don't over leverage. I've seen interest rates back to the ERM days go from 4% to 15% pretty much overnight. So as long as you don't overextend, as long as you don't over leverage, when they go up, it won't come as a shock. And once they've gone up, given time, they'll come down again. But when? Well, hang on, let me give you some kind of prediction, if that's what you want. The next time we get a Labour government, interest rates will rise.
Richard,
I'm always a bit shocked at how nervous people are about interest rates. I hear people saying, I'm going to get a 5-year fix because, we've no idea where interest rates are going. And I think it's important to make sort of evidence-based decisions on interest rates and look at the economic factors, as Paul has suggested. I don't think we're going to see an interest rate rise before Brexit, because I think although inflation is going to go up, the Chancellor thinks it's going to peak at, or the OBR thinks it's going to peak at 2.4%, which isn't, not a big issue. Interest rates could go up to try and bring inflation down, but I don't think they'll need to. The EU, Eurozone is still pretty fragile economically, and so I think we're looking at a good 2 years of having interest rates more or less where they are, and I suspect we'll see rises start at some point thereafter, maybe 3+ years on. But they're going to be gradual when they eventually go up. And don't forget that, people have been saying interest rates are going to rise in 2 or 3 years for the past 5 or 6 years, haven't they? So, there's lots of unknowns still.
Any thoughts on that one, Andy?
Well, I think I'm going to have to bow down to my colleagues' expertise in this area. Personal opinion, I'm with Richard. I can't see anything happening pre-Brexit or even post-Brexit for another year or so.
I'd like to move now on to insurance, and we'll start with you on this one, Andy. Again, looking at stability of costs and in the insurance sector, what's your view on that?
Well, there is uncertainty, as we've mentioned, and insurers obviously see that as well. Their return on investment is being squeezed, as is everybody's. So generally, you can probably expect to see costs start to creep up. But the flip side to this is we're going through a relatively benign weather period. So from an insurer perspective, the last sort of 18, 12 months have been quite good. There's been no significant weather events, so that helps rates stay low. Buy-to-let is good insurance business, especially investors' portfolio business. Again, so I think that will temper the rates that insurers try and put in. But what I would say is that there is something called insurance premium tax, which is being crept up steadily over the last few years. So 18 months ago, it was at 5%. It's currently at 10%, going up to 12% in June, probably going to go up to 20% at some point. So I think it is a steep rise, and it's a little bit under the radar. So I think the increase in insurance costs you're likely to see will be predominantly IPT related.
Thank you. And Richard, obviously you have insurance.
Yes, I have lots and lots of insurance policies, and my advice for this is don't be too passive as a consumer, because you get that renewal form through and it sounds about right, so you just pay it. But I would say don't do that. I keep a spreadsheet of all of my insurance premiums. I know what they've been for the last 4 or 5 years on each property, and so I have a look at whether it's gone up much, and if it has, then I call the insurer and see if we can look at another underwriter and get it down. So it's one of those things where you need to make sure you apply some pressure on the costs, I think.
And do you chat with landlords who need advice, Tony?
Yeah, insurance is always on the agenda, but most people don't actually understand how insurance works. It's the second largest capital market in the world. It's got very little to do whatsoever with risk transfer at all. It's, can I get a return on my capital? That's what underwriters and the people who fund them actually do. The other great influence on it is the weather. If there's a particularly bad hurricane season, everyone at Lloyd's goes, ouch, and they have to get their money back, so premium rises. The trick with insurance to get the best possible rates, taxes to one side, is to act as if you weren't insured. Manage your affairs in such a way that you minimise the risk. Better quality appliances, better quality labour. Have stuff that doesn't break, have stuff that you maintain regularly. And ultimately, it's what are known as the force majeure events. The bloody house burning down, the lightning hitting it, the flood that you can't control. Those are the bits that you really need to insure. And don't look around for the cheapest. The lowest price typically gets you the worst cover. Speak to somebody who knows what they're doing. Get the right cover for the right risk. And if you pay a bit more, you pay a bit more. But what you want is when the worst does happen, they send you a cheque and not a loss adjuster who's going to beat you down.
Paul, all investments need to be insured?
Well, they should be. They don't necessarily need to be, but yeah, we advise on insurance, and I agree with Richard. Insurance is a lot like finance. It's worth reviewing all the time. Often you get the best deal at the point of putting it in place. So if you forget about it, you'll often notice that the prices are increasing and that you could get a better deal elsewhere. So reviewing it constantly, making sure you're not overpaying, reviewing what it includes, and that you have in place the inclusions that you want or need and that are relevant to your property or to your portfolio, and balancing cost with benefit.
Thank you very much. I think we've covered the value of it. Can I ask you each for a top tip on insurance? Andy?
Yeah, I've got a couple. Actually, I think just to go back on some of those comments, I would absolutely agree that the cheapest is not always the best. Make sure you have the right levels of cover, make sure you're not overpaying, but certainly do not see insurance as an area where you can cut back, and do not intentionally underinsure. I think those are false economies which may hurt you in the long term. Top tips, as Tony says, risk management, inspect your properties, especially if they're void. Escape of water claims, devastating for an empty property, and they're our second highest claims at Simple Landlords. We're also seeing an increase in cannabis factories, so reference your tenants, drive past your properties. If the windows are boarded up, shut. If it doesn't look right, get friendly with the neighbours, just become more aware of what's going on in the properties. As far as tips in terms of cover are concerned, something that's often overlooked is your voluntary excess. So this is where you take on an element of the risk yourself. 95% of Simple Landlord customers have an excess of £300 or less. And that accounts for portfolio landlords as well. And I have a very small portfolio, but I have a network of contacts in building, plumbing, decorating trades. So for a relatively small increase in your excess, so you could go up to £500 or £1,000, you can get actually quite significant decreases in premium. So you could be looking at over 20% reduction in premium for a relatively small increase in excess. One of the reasons being is insurers, it costs money to handle claims, obviously, and the smaller claims are the claims that cost quite a lot of money to handle relative to their value. So from an insurer perspective, you can cut out the low value claims, you can actually make quite good savings on your portfolio. So I think my top tip would be look at your excesses and see if you're willing to take on an element of that risk yourself.
Thank you. One quick top tip, quickly, please.
Well, my would be don't claim, unless it's something really major. Avoid anything to do with subsidence like the plague, because it seems to be the complete kiss of death insurance-wise. Inspections of properties, make sure you do regular inspections to see if there are any electrical hazards, etc. And also when the property's empty, you need to do regular inspections these days as well for lots of insurers, and you will often just end up on flea covers, so you need to kind of learn about that and what that is and what the best insurers are around empty properties.
Thank you. Tony?
Tell the truth. Non-disclosure of a material fact will invalidate your claim. So keep it straight and you'll have the covers you want.
Paul, quick top tip.
Assess your options through independent advice. Unless you're particularly savvy with insurance yourself, speak to someone who knows what they're talking about that isn't just trying to sell you something.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next topic, which is build to rent. The government seems to have suddenly discovered build to rent. Let's put lots of money into it. Let's got lots of big mega developments on the go. Let's have another dig at an ordinary landlord. Anyway, it's difficult to work out what's going to happen. I certainly struggle with it. So is it going to have an impact on smaller landlords? Paul, these big developers coming in, building mega tower blocks and renting them out to young professionals?
Potentially, and I think, in my opinion, when you've got a big development that offers a range of facilities, it is going to be more attractive than the stock standard residential property around the corner that doesn't offer those things. In my opinion, it's a bit of if you can't beat them, join them type situation. You can invest in those similar type properties and you can offer those facilities and you can compete with these big funds that are also building these developments. Because that's what young professionals want these days. So if that's your target market, you need to make sure you're offering what the target market wants.
And what's your take on this one, Tony?
Pretty much the same. It's just another manifestation of a current market. Actually, it's a really good idea, build to rent. It's a way of dealing with some of the social housing crisis. And property development, either in terms of flipping or keeping them yourself and managing them as rented properties, is a perfectly good business strategy and should be part of how you diversify your portfolio. Will it kill the individual buy-to-let? Probably not. Once again, demand exceeds supply. And there will always be the right property for the right person in the right area.
Are you ready to invest, Richard?
No, not in build to rent. It seems to have been a sort of fairly fledgling business up until recently. I think something like 15 housing associations have got involved in build to rent. 4% of new starts in 15-16 were build to rent. In London, 25% of new starts last year were build to rent. But that's still a drop in the ocean, really. And the Greater London Authority thinks that most of the properties being built are serving those sort of upper echelons of the market. And if you think about all of those student new builds that are put up in places like Nottingham and the North East and so on, the other landlords who provide terraced housing and etc. still survive, and there's still demand for both types of property. So hopefully, we will be able to survive alongside one another.
Andy, Simple Landlord looked at this area?
It's not an area that's really on our radar yet. We're keeping a watching brief on it. We've not had much feedback from our landlords on build to rent, so I think it's watch this space. Maybe one of those things that actually it's quite a good soundbite, and so it sounds a lot more impressive. But it was interesting to hear Richard's stats because they're actually, in the big scheme of things, not much there yet.
Has anybody got any thoughts on how this will affect rental rates and quality in the private rental sector, if at all?
I think it depends on the types of properties you're investing in or that you have. If you're investing in a 20-year-old apartment in a city centre and a nice new build-to-rent development opens up across the road, then I think there's no doubt that it could potentially affect you. It does all tie back to the supply and demand. You know, if in most of the cities UK-wide, predominantly for the past sort of 10 to 15 years, there's been a major undersupply, so there's a huge backlog, and then we're still undersupplying year on year. So that the demand is quite strong. However, you know, we certainly encourage our clients to be investing in properties that are going to be most desirable to the target market, because that's what's going to drive rents, and that's what will also drive your resale values.
And Tony, is there going to be an impact on rents?
Not a clue. Do you want an honest answer? I don't know. Yeah, it may in some areas, but overall it will balance out. And even if it does have an impact on rents, as long as you're not over leveraged, it won't make a great deal of difference. You will make money.
And Richard, are you worried by build-to-rent?
Not really, no. I mean, I think London's rental market is dysfunctional. You can rent absolutely grotesque properties because there's so much demand. So if build-to-rent improves standards and means that lower end of the market drops out, then that would be all to the good, I think. The government's quite confused in terms of policy around this because, you know, stamp duty...
Well, I'm not the only one that's confused.
Sorry. Because actually, you know, if developers want to buy land to build to rent, if it's over more than 1.05 million, then they're paying those higher rates of stamp duty. So there's a kind of built-in deterrent there. And I think a lot of institutional investors as well are put off by these constant layers of regulation that keep coming out, and also the shifting tax environment. What institutional investors need is long-term certainty, and I'm not sure the government's creating the right environment for that.
That's very kind. Now, I'd like to move on to our final topic, which is letting fees. Now, I get confused about this as well, because I come from Scotland and we don't have letting fees. I think they're going to be interested in England. I don't know what's happening in Wales, so I'm going to go over to the panel. Letting fees. The government wants to ban them. What will this mean for rent, for agents, for costs?
Well, Richard might disagree with me on this one, but I don't think that landlords determine rents. You know, a lot of people talk about landlords needing to increase rents to account for these new costs that they're going to have to pay. My view is that the reality is landlords aren't that organised. They don't all meet every Friday and say, let's increase rents, which means rents are determined by the market. You know, we've spoken about supply and demand so much today. That's what it's determined by. So if you increase your rent, your property just won't rent. And it might rent, you might rent it for a year, but it won't rent as readily as if you were renting in competition with the rest of the properties in the market. So, you know, I suppose if it does result in the cost being passed over to landlords, it's another cost, which ties in again with what we've been discussing. It's going to hit your net yield and again increases the reason to be looking at your yields more closely.
Tony, what's your take on this one?
Suck it up. Forget it. It doesn't make a blind bit of difference. It's yet another transactional cost of doing business. If there is a letting fee, if there isn't a letting fee, do I care? No. As long as the portfolio that I run yields the amount I want it to yield, that's just the cost of doing business. It's like VAT or a window tax or an estate agent's fee when I sell my property. Immaterial at the end of the day.
What's your experience of letting fees, Richard?
Yes, my experience is that I use, in common with lots of landlords, I use letting agents occasionally on a let-only basis, and I usually try to negotiate the fee down. I'm not happy at all with renewal fees, which we have in London, which I think are just money for old rope, so it's very important to negotiate that out of the transaction. We've been doing some research on it at the NLA, and 8 in 10 landlords think that their charges from agents will go up, interestingly, and 40% of those said that they would pass those on in rent increases. Although I agree with what Paul's saying, I don't think landlords control rents. I think the market does. So this idea that, you know, we can just shove up the rents, I think it is ridiculous. But I don't see letting agent fees going up as a response. I think there will be too much competition. I think there are too many letting agents. I think we're going to see an erosion of the number of letting agents because of what's going on online. And I think there are too many ropey agents out there as well that need to up their game. And we've seen some good work in East London where Newham, for example, is with their 190 agents in the borough, are introducing a 0 to 5 sort of numbering scheme, a bit like the environmental health thing that, the numbers on the doors, the scores on the doors thing, where they're going to rate all of their agents. And I think we're going to see increasing pressure on agents to up their game and improve. So
you're in favour of more regulation of letting agents?
I absolutely am. I think it is. I agree with, I can't remember who coined the phrase, that it is a bit of the Wild West, really, of the rental market. It angers me that landlords get blamed for what is often the fault of agents. There are some very good agents out there, of course, but there are a lot of ropey ones. This whole business of shelter campaigning for 3-year mandatory tenancy agreements is because agents want churn and they want to move tenants on every 12 months. As a landlord, I don't want that. I want my tenant to stay as long as possible. And in fact, on average, tenants stay for over 4 years. So, it's a bit of a love-hate relationship, I think, between letting agents and landlords. And I personally don't think it's fair for them to charge tenants fees. The NLA's view on this is that it's reasonable for them to charge fees where they incur costs. And the devil will be in the detail on this. So, for example, referencing fees. If there isn't a reference fee to the tenant, then the tenant could just say, go on, reference me, even though they know they've got a CCJ, and they might ask 4 or 5 different agents to reference them at the same time. So there could be kind of, a lot of wasting of money going on there that wouldn't happen if the tenant had to pay the fee.
Does this impact on your business at all?
Slightly, I think. I completely agree with the panel that the market will dictate rental prices. I think impact on insurance is if a landlord does look to increase rents, you might see more void periods, so you need to be aware of that. If you decide not to reference because of the fees, then you might invalidate some legal or rent guarantee policies, so you need to be aware of your terms and conditions. But other than that, I don't think it will be a huge impact.
And it's just another cost, isn't it, that we could do without?
Yeah, of course you can do without yet another cost, but it is another cost. It's a fact of business. It costs to do business, and whether you're a landlord or a corner shop or anything else, you have to pay to trade.
But it's the tenants here that are benefiting, don't forget. And I think, they're often paying I had a tenant who's rents one of my properties, and they've decided to rent another one for some family that are coming over. And they're saying, one of the great things for us is we're saving £700 in fees from a letting agent. And it shocks me, that they're having to pay that much. And I personally don't feel very comfortable with that. So I think the argument is quite strong, actually, in favour of tenants not having to pay these fees. I don't think it's going to affect us very much as landlords.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you for the panel. I'm now going to move on to open questions from the audience. If I could just say, if you would like to ask a question, if you could stand up, say who you are, if you're from a company, if you could say which company you're from, and also which panellist you'd like to address your question to. So I'd like to open it up. Who's got a question, please? Don't be shy. Yes, this lady at the front here.
Angela Ellis-Jones. I wonder if you could explain the ways in which one can get around the restrictions introduced in his budget by George Osborne and enable people nevertheless to make money out of buy-to-let.
I assume we're referring to mortgage interest, the way it's treated from a tax perspective?
Yes.
Okay. The ways of getting around it. As Tony quite rightly mentioned, the change doesn't actually affect anybody who's on the basic rate of tax, which is a common misconception we find. Something you do need to be careful of is that the way the changes have been done, you can be pushed up, but that generally happens if you're borderline anyway, which means that as of April this year, if you're earning less than £50,000 per annum, the changes won't actually affect you at all. And I suppose one way of taking advantage of that is we find that most of our clients are couples, and one is earning more than the other. Having an investment in the lower earning person's name is one way around the change.
Yeah, it's not quite as simple as that, in that you can be below the 50,000 threshold, but as a result of the way the calculation is done, you can end up being over the £50,000 threshold. So at the moment you would deduct, so you've got gross rental income minus expenses minus mortgage interest gives you effectively, the pre-tax profit. From the 6th of April, it's gross rental income minus expenses gives you your pre-tax profit, and then you'll get a tax credit on the remaining sum. And that can easily be enough to push you into the higher rates. So is there any way round it? Well, it comes down to structure. And probably the most effective way of owning property is using a hybrid, which is a combination of personal ownership, limited liability partnerships, and limited companies, all in conjunction. And providing that you're running this as a business, you don't fall foul of the mixed partnership rules, and effectively at that point, Section 24, or any of the other nasties like inheritance tax, will cease to affect you. That's the very simple answer. Simulator for the more complex one.
What about inheritance tax? I mean, are there changes coming to that may affect landlords? Nothing on the pipeline?
Look, inheritance tax is state-sponsored grave robbery. It's been around forever. And bear in mind, it's the state protection racket. That's how it works everywhere in the world and always has. I hate inheritance tax. It's the most pernicious of all taxes. Investment properties, investment businesses, non-trading businesses are all fully subject to inheritance tax at 40%. The only way that you can deal with it is either to run a trading business, which if properly constructed, a property business can be. You can, my favourite solution to inheritance tax is die with threepence. A penny for each eye and one for the ferryman, and have some fun. Don't worry about leaving it to the kids. You've had them, fed them, clothed them, educated them. What more do they want, for goodness sake? Sex and drugs and rock and roll is much underrated, okay? Enjoy yourself.
Glad you're not my dad, then.
Yeah, and give it away during your lifetime. At least you get the warm, cuddly feeling of somebody saying thank you. All right? However, all right, look, you can deal with IHT in a number of ways, other than spending it. You can pay it in advance at a discount. You can insure it. And in most cases, the premiums work out significantly less than the tax bill would be. The premiums themselves are deductible for IHT purposes under the normal income and expenditure rules. And if the policy is written in the right kind of simple discretionary trust, it pays out free of tax to pay the tax bill. But there are structural ways in which you can deal with it within property.
Richard, have you anything to add to that?
Probably not, no, because obviously you're
Yes, the tax expert. Okay, could I have another question, please? This gentleman at the front, please.
Hi, this one's to Richard. It's Sanjay. You touched on the property cycle and it peaking around about 2025. So do you actually follow the 18-year property cycle? And if you do, whereabouts do you think we are in the cycle at the moment?
Oh gosh, this is really Richard Blanco and his crystal ball here. I guess, I bought my first property in 1995. So, just looking back at the graph, at when prices went up and when they came down again and so on. I'm afraid I haven't done anything any more technical than that, really. And just observing, the economics and so on. And just going for my gut feeling, really, that's all I'm doing. I'm sure lots of other people have done a lot more technical stuff around it than I have. So my gut feeling is that, and given that, I'd quite like to start selling in about 10 years' time, it all kind of fits together for me, really. So I don't think I don't want to say it's totally unsophisticated and just me licking my finger and sticking it in the air. That's my considered opinion, I guess. Really, yeah.
Yes, this lady in second row, please.
Hello. Added on to the question that you had about what can we do to cut or mitigate against all these taxes, particularly the mortgage relief. I was surprised that none of you mentioned this, but maybe that's because this is what I've decided to do, and I thought a lot of people had, and maybe it's actually a stupid thing to do. But anyway, if I can just make the comment, and I get what you're saying, Tony, suck this, suck that, suck something else, won't make much difference. However, even when you've got a portfolio, which probably quite a lot of us have, that we've done our homework, we've got our yields, looking at yields is a bit of a stupid thing because you do that when you buy.
Do we have a question?
Yeah, the question, one is a lot of things will start making a loss. People want to sell. I see the only way forward, and I want to know what you think, is to start Airbnb-ing them rather than, because then you do not have to pay you get the mortgage interest relief that you always had. And I know the government doesn't want us to do that, but I see that as the simplest solution.
You hit the 90 days limit though, don't you?
There's restrictions on that, isn't there?
Yeah, there's ways around it.
In London, there's a 90-day limit because of bylaws that you can't let on a short term for more than 90 days. And if you want to become kind of serviced apartments, etc., then you have to apply for planning permission or holiday lets. So it's quite complicated in London. I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but do you want to talk about it from a tax perspective?
Don't let the tax tail wag the planning dog. Coming at this from a tax perspective is fundamentally flawed, and you'll drive yourself nuts. You have to look at this as a business. I have a sum of capital, either my own or which I've leveraged. How can I best apply that capital to get the maximum amount of wealth in your pocket? I know my business is called Less Tax for Landlords, and yes, it does do what it says on the tin, but the truth of the matter is, I don't care if any of our clients save a penny piece in tax. What I really care about more than anything is that they have enough money in the first place to pay tax and that they meet their wealth creation goals. And whether that's Airbnb, whether it's buy-to-let, whether it's development, whether it's commercial, whether it's refurb, whether it's flip, whether it's equities or running a corner shop, it's how do I get the return on my capital is the most effective way to plan. Now, admittedly, how much tax you pay can affect that ROI. Yeah. But the first thing you have to decide to work out is, why am I doing this? What do I want for myself? You know, none of you here set out to be a landlord. You set out to make some money. But what you didn't set out to do is know how much of what, by when, by whom, and why. So before anyone can answer that question, let alone yourself, you've got to answer, why am I doing it? You know, tenants and toilets are bloody hard work. There's no question about it. There are easier ways of earning a living. So, why are you doing it? And once you know why and how much you need in order to achieve that why, then you can start to look at Airbnb or X or Y or Z in order to make your money. But don't sweat the tax. You know, tax is a byproduct of being wealthy. Concentrate on that first.
Thank you.
Just from a finance perspective as well, you need to be a bit careful with the Airbnb or service accommodation model. Is a lot of people don't realise that in a lot of cases that will break the terms of your mortgage, and the lender could recall your mortgage on the spot. So you could find yourself in quite a lot of hot water by short-term letting your property, whether it be them just discovering it on Airbnb, which is probably less likely, but certainly when it comes time to remortgage, you just won't get a mortgage. Unless it's a commercial mortgage.
Anybody, is that it? Okay, gentleman with his hand at the back, please.
Yeah, we haven't really seen what Philip Hammond's attitude is to the buy-to-let market yet. We certainly saw what George Osborne's was. Can you hear me?
Not really, no.
We've certainly seen what George Osborne's attitude was to the buy-to-let market. We haven't seen Philip Hammond's fully yet. Philip Hammond hasn't put his cards on the table yet. What is your gut instinct about his attitude to buy-to-let?
There's
Do you think he has?
Yes, I mean, I think I know people who were campaigning around the tax changes had a 10-minute meeting with Philip Hammond. They had a 10-minute meeting with Gavin Barwell and a 10-minute meeting with the Prime Minister. And
20 minutes altogether then?
yes, it was on separate days. And my understanding of Philip Hammond's attitude was, my civil servants have given me the stats. It's only going to affect 20% of landlords. It's going to have a marginal impact on everyone. And, as far as I'm concerned, that's not very much collateral damage. And, what he's not persuaded by is the unfairness of being taxed on turnover. He probably doesn't understand it. And, of course, landlords are very unpopular amongst the public, so changing taxes in our favour is not a vote winner. So I think it's, we're in danger of these tax changes just being there till the next generation, really. Unless what happens is, what I understand happened in Ireland, where there was quite a negative impact on the market and changes were made thereafter. But I get it's difficult because in some ways we don't want anything in the budget on us. We want to just be forgotten about in a way, really, because when they start thinking about us, they start coming up with really stupid ideas. So it's tricky, and yet we want them to think about us, try and change stuff. But I don't get the sense that the government's particularly on our side, really, and they're certainly very enthusiastic about regulation at the moment.
Sorry, what I was thinking, do you think they're going to be as aggressive as George Osborne was against the BTL market? They seem a little bit more circumspect. Sorry.
Actually, just to add one more thing, I think the tragedy really was that Brexit happened when it did. If it had happened a year earlier, I think we wouldn't have had these changes, because they would have been too worried about the impact on the housing market. And of course, Philip Hammond isn't such a political chancellor. So for some reason, George Osborne sort of got the bit between his teeth, didn't he, really, on it? And Generation Rent won the day, really. I think it was a coming together of a number of factors that was very unfortunate for us.
Are landlords particularly on Philip's agenda? Not especially. He probably doesn't give a stuff one way or the other. What he really wants to do is raise revenue for UK PLC, to pay off debt, and hopefully make our lives, make this a good place to live. That's the whole point of taxation. Landlord and tax collector are the two oldest insults. Okay, landlords are a highly visible, easy target. And if you start to peel it back even to Osborne's time, one of the key, at least stated drivers, was to remove the accidental landlord and have a much better run, much more regulated professional sector. And the bugger was really clever. Okay? He was trying to do what HMRC tried to do 20 years ago, get rid of self-employment, make everybody limited companies. Why? Because limited companies are easy to tax. Once again, I'll come back to it. Politicians of every colour will try and put their hand as far down their trouser pocket or in your purse as they can legally reach. And thanks to the Duke of Westminster in 1936, you are entitled to do exactly the same, but in opposite, to try and stop them. Don't worry about the tax. Don't worry about the Chancellor. Make money. Become financially independent. Use it wisely.
Thank you. I think this lady here has got a question. Thank you.
So I'm banging on the same theme here about withdrawal of mortgage tax relief. One of the solutions that the panel have said is that if a property is owned jointly between a married couple, to transfer the interest in the property to the lesser earning individual. But what is the effect on the mortgage? So you can gain the maximum tax relief by doing that if you're transferring it to the lower rate tax earner. But what's the effect on the mortgage? Can you still jointly 50-50 have the mortgage, but the ownership be in the lower earning person's name? Or does the whole of the mortgage then have to be reassessed in terms of affordability based on the lower earning person?
So just on the mortgages, mortgages are wholly and severally, you're liable for the whole mortgage if you're on a mortgage. So even if you only own 1% of a property, if you are one of the mortgagees, then you are liable for 100% of the mortgage. So they don't split percentages between mortgages. You can obviously split percentages between ownership, but my understanding of that is that doesn't necessarily determine the beneficiary of that income. And I'll pass you over to Tony because he's probably better to comment on that.
So sorry, so does that mean that you can therefore transfer the ownership 99% to the lower earning person but still have the same responsibility on the higher earner, the 1% owner, to honour the whole of the mortgage, therefore it wouldn't have to be reassessed for affordability?
Hang on, you're conflating different things.
No, I'm just trying to summarise my
yeah.
understanding of the statement there, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. In law, you can separate ownership from enjoyment from control. So I own this microphone, I give the enjoyment of it to Paul to use, and I give the control of it, the power socket, to somebody else. And because of that, you can play around with the taxation. You can have the mortgage solely in your name, and you can elect to have the income paid to somebody else. I think it's Form 17, can't remember offhand. Yeah, if they're a lower rate taxpayer and you're a higher rate taxpayer. Right? So whose name on the mortgage deed, who the actual owner is immaterial when it comes to the income it generates and the tax that's paid on it, because you're allowed to separate the ownership from the payment of the rents. Right? So you can.
Does that mean that somebody could receive the rent and not actually own the property?
Yes, totally. Yeah. So if you've got a lower rate taxpayer in the equation, you pay them as much of the rent as it can until it takes until the higher rate, and there's an HMRC form that you can complete, and your day-to-day high street accountant should have advised you on that one a long time ago.
Okay, and do you have to have completed that form to formally do that, or can you just change the apportionment in the tax returns?
I think you can change the apportionment in the tax return.
Without formally going through a...
Yeah, but personally I'm not a chartered accountant, my business partner is. I do cryptic crossword puzzles for a living. But that's, I believe, perfectly acceptable.
That's interesting thought there. Have we got another question, please? Yes, this gentleman here, please. Thank you.
You need to fill that form every year, the Form 17 you said?
I think it may be a once-off election, but the truth, the answer is I can't tell you offhand.
Okay, you said Form 17, 17, right?
It's something that we've looked into quite a bit, and so far as everything goes with tax, it's a bit of a grey area. HMRC can challenge anything. You could not fill in the form, you could fill in the form, regardless of whether you do or you don't. HMRC can still challenge it, and you need to be able to justify the way you've allocated the income.
Have we got another subject, please? Gentlemen. Thank you.
This is again for Tony. Now, your strategy is very complex, is for multimillionaires, and like Richard, they are a guru property.
Could I just ask you a question?
Yes. I am presenting the strategy first. So for Duke of Westminster and other people. Now, what about the small landlords? Can we reduce this non-artificial personalities to just a limited company? Now, more clear, money in, money out on limited company. You have your own properties, money in, money out to your companies. Is this...
Want to ask for the question clearly, please. We can't quite understand what you're asking. Are you asking about limited companies or...
Madam, before making the question, you need to make clear what is the question about.
No, I just like the question.
So, can I ask the question or not?
The question, please.
Yes. So, can we reduce this strategy LLP, limited company, and personal name to personal name, limited company, and the ownership is personal, limited company is managing, and yes, money in, money out. Can we or not?
No, you're engaging in a wholly artificial relationship there. You know, it's verging on avoidance. Organising your property affairs comes down to what the economics of your property affairs are. If you're not going to be affected by Section 24, then actually, from that perspective, there's no need to do anything. You may not be affected by Section 24, but still have a humongous inheritance tax problem. Sorry, you won't, your children will, in which case a structural change will come about. You know, running your properties through your own letting agency and charging fees in itself is perfectly fine, as long as you don't take the mick about how much those fees are. And anything above 17-20% is probably pushing it to the limit. Regardless, the minute you're in a limited company, you're subject to double taxation. You've got corporation tax on profit, and then income or dividend tax on national insurance on any money that you take out. There is no one size fits all. You have to do the detail, you have to work the math. Am I going to get a return on investment? Am I doing this purely to save tax, or am I doing it because it's a great way of growing my portfolio? Sorry I can't be more exact, but that's just the way it is, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Have we got any more questions from the audience, please? I can't have answered all your questions. Yes.
Hi, Rashmi Panchal. Rashmi Panchal here. You mentioned that the additional 3% tax that you pay, you claim it back anyway. Are you talking about it by way of an expense or otherwise?
It's a capital cost. So you claim it back when you sell. As a capital cost.
Okay. Well, I've got a question for the panel. Where's the best place to buy in the market at the moment?
This is our area of specialty, really, so hopefully I can answer the question. Most of our clients have been investing in the northwest. We've noticed a big shift away from what was in the past, the safe haven, London. You simply can't lose money, and that's both domestic buyers and overseas buyers, and we deal with both. Obviously, with the way that London prices have gone and the fact that yields haven't kept up, that's becoming less of a viable option for, it's great for people who've already got portfolios, but for those who are looking to build a portfolio, it's more difficult unless, you're buying and renovating or something like that and adding value. So when you can buy good quality properties in good areas at much lower values and achieve, 7-8% yields whilst borrowing at 2 or 3%, it's almost a no-brainer to be looking at those types of options. Obviously, all the same fundamentals apply, but I suppose broadening your horizons, I assume most people here are from London, broadening your horizons beyond the 5 miles around your own home, which is where most people tend to invest, to looking at new options, I think is the best way to go.
On the one hand, you can say, buy in low capital value areas, get maximum yield. I mean, my business partner and some of the things we do, we buy properties not in the northwest but in the northeast. We never pay more than £50,000 for an oven-ready buy-to-let, and we consistently get a minimum of £110 a week rents. Thank you. Marvellous yield, crap capital values. It will never increase, but we're making our money as we go. Generally, though, it's not really about geography. My own strategy has been to always buy the cheapest house on the dearest road. Do it up to the highest possible standard and rent it to the richest tenants I can find. It works for me.
I used to love playing Monopoly when I was a kid, and being a landlord isn't Monopoly, of course, because you're dealing with people's lives, tenants, etc., and so there's a lot more responsibility involved. But I always used to buy the Whitechapels and the Pentonville Road, the cheaper end there. And because I started from scratch, I just happened to buy a property in Hackney that went up lots, and then I remortgaged it to take capital out. I've tended to buy wrecks at auction and refurbish, and I think that you probably still can do that in London, in the sense that you can buy in areas where we're expecting, as I've said before, infrastructure improvements. So along Crossrail, there's Crossrail 2 coming, of course, which is something to keep an eye on, and all those sorts of areas where there are developments going on in London. So Croydon and Brent Cross and Old Oak Common, and all of those sorts of areas are worth looking at still. London seems to be a series of micro markets at the moment. So whilst Hackney, where I live, seems to have really hit the doldrums, someone was telling me yesterday that Walthamstow has gone completely bonkers, which seems quite odd, but I guess it's because prices there are still quite a bit lower than in Zone 2. So sort of Lewishams and Hither Greens and Walthamstows and so on are getting a bit of a boom from the fact that people have stopped being able to buy in those places like Hackney. I would worry about, I would never buy outside of London, actually. I'm quite traditional in the sense that I buy close to home. I want to be within half an hour of the property. I want to keep an eye on it. And I also really value that relationship I have with my tenants, because it means that they look after the property. They're less likely to fall into arrears because they know me. And, I think that personal interaction and that relationship between me and the tenant is incredibly valuable. I did have a property up in Newark. It didn't go up at all. The rent never went up. It just felt like a complete waste of time. So I'm very much wedded to sticking to my local area, I think.
Well, the only thing I would add is do your research. If it's not an area you're that familiar with, checks. Flooding's probably the big issue from an insurer perspective. It's probably going to get worse as spending on flood defences has decreased over time. So it's probably going to get harder to insure, or at least more expensive to insure. So if it's not an area you're familiar with, do your research on it. Look for flooding, look for subsidence issues. Just be aware.
Paul, are any investors favouring particular types of property? And if so, why?
Well, I can only comment from our experience and where our clients are investing. And I'd say predominantly our clients have been investing in sort of city centre locations. Tony commented on sort of the northeast, lower value properties haven't really moved in value. That's not really our approach. We're looking at kind of city centre, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, places where you can still get a really good 2-bed, 2-bath for less than 200 grand, and it's yielding 7 or 8%.
We've also got HS2 coming up.
HS2, so there's over £12 billion of infrastructure projects in Liverpool at the moment, which might seem like an oxymoron, but there's lots happening in that city, which we've found that just most people don't know about. London tends to be very London-centric. So that's our approach, and our clients are doing well from it. And
type of property? Flats, houses?
Mostly flats, and the base here, both work. It's just about, I suppose, we focus on as much depth in the market as possible. Large tenant pools, a broad range of industries, therefore employment, areas with facilities, infrastructure, amenities, and those things are growing. I talk 2 or 3 times a month at seminars and things, and something I often say is that property doesn't just grow in value, and people look at me like I'm stupid. But it doesn't. There needs to be change in the market for prices to change. So targeting all those fundamentals and all those things tend to result in better socioeconomic levels, lower vacancy rates, and therefore less risk.
What have you found about types of property that are popular to invest in at the moment?
Probably the biggest single trend we've seen is with high-end HMOs. Larger properties designed for family living, kitted out and refurbed to really high standards. And in that, there's been a sub-market of actually people developing them as HMOs and then selling them on for a turn, or managing them on behalf of other investors. That would be about the only clear trend that we've seen. Overall the market is still very mixed.
Yep, I would say I've seen a trend in people going to mixed commercial residential because of the lower stamp duty rates, and it's more favourable tax-wise now within the new regime. The most, in NLA research, the most popular properties are terraced houses. I must admit, I'm not a fan of new builds because, of course, you then have management charges and you're also buying the property at a premium because it is a new build. And, in this current point in the cycle, I would be quite wary of buying new builds, particularly outside of London, because it just brings back too many memories of 2006-07 and when we hit the peak then. So I would tread very carefully around that sort of proposition at the moment, personally. Sorry to be controversial.
Andy, have you noticed anything research-wise on this?
We have, yeah. 87% of our customer base have detached houses or bungalows, and we haven't really seen that shift yet. We are expecting to see more diversification in terms of HMOs, mixed-use commercial. But one thing I would say on the new builds, and probably to reinforce Richard's concerns, we are seeing an increase in water damage claims for newer properties, 1990 onwards, possibly linked to en-suites, and more likely linked to this push-fit plumbing that's the norm nowadays. So just be aware.
Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time. I'd like to say thank you to everybody in the audience for coming along today. We really appreciate that you came along to find out more. Buy-to-let is something that Property War will be continuing to inform you about through our daily news service and also through our weekly newsletter. If you don't get our weekly newsletter, please go onto the website and sign up. Thank you again to our panellists. You've been absolutely super. And they'll be available for further chatting during our networking session. And thank you to our sponsors, because we wouldn't be here without you.